Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we are going to be polishing off the section by having our fades happen between our scene loads, like so. And to do that, we're going to have to persist the fader between scenes so that it can remember whether it was faded down or faded up, and we don't have to do anything complicated there. So we're going to find a way of doing this without using the Singleton pattern, which has many disadvantages, and we're going to do this in a nice way instead. So let's dive in and see what that way is. So at the moment, our fader is not prefabbed and not shared between scenes. That's something we're going to fix. So I'm going to go and select the game core folder and prefab fader into there. And I'm also going to go ahead and prefab the whole of this core under core, because what I want to do is make sure that that is in every scene so that we don't have to make sure that there's a player, there's a camera, there's a fader, all these things that we're going to have in every scene. We can just plonk in the core prefab, and what you can see now is that this is a nested prefab like we've got before. If I open up the core prefab, you can see it has the player's prefab in it, has the fader's prefab in it, hasn't gone and flattened things out. Now, if I go ahead and open up Sandbox 2, I'm going to save my changes, and I am going to find the game core folder and drag in the core prefab in the place of the player. Would help if I'm in the scene view. So let's go ahead and find the player in the scene, double click him to locate him, then drag in our core into here, like so. And you can see my player is not located at the center of core. I think that's a bit... well, we'll update it here in this scene anyway. So I'm going to set the position of my player to 000, so he's there, and I'm going to delete that original core folder so there's not a duplicate, and just rename the prefabbed one so we've got consistency. There's my player. So if I go into the scene now, we should see that it all plays perfectly, and we've got the fader automatically in our second scene as well, which is essentially what we wanted to be able to do. However, you will notice that with this fader, if I go between levels, it resets and starts again. And that's not what we want. We want this fader to hold its state between levels, because what we're going to be doing is, as we walk through a portal, we're going to be fading out, and then we want it to fade back in the new level. So we want it to be able to remember that we had faded out and there's no glitching, no loading, no problems like that. Now, this is the point at which most people tend to reach for the Singleton pattern. However, there's a few reasons I really dislike the Singleton pattern. Now, the first one is that it leads to really tight coupling, because with a Singleton pattern, you can always access the class from anywhere, which means that you tend to access it from anywhere, and that means that any class is going to rely on it, so it's often very tightly coupled. It also is too much responsibility for one class, because the class has to be responsible for making sure that it's the only instance around, as well as doing its normal job. And it removes our flexibility, because what if we decide that all of a sudden we don't want our fader to be a singleton anymore? It's going to change everything that depends on it, because everything thought that it was the only thing around, everything thought that you would get it by getting the fader.instance. And if that is not the case, then how are we going to do it properly? So I'm going to propose an alternative to using the Singleton pattern, where we instead have a prefab of objects that we want to persist between levels. And I'm going to call these the persistent objects. So I'm going to create a new empty game object and call it persistent objects. And under that, I'm going to drag our fader object. Now notice, because I've just prefabbed it, I'm going to have to go into the core prefab and remove the fader from the core prefab. And I'm going to drop it on to the persistent objects. And I'm going to make a prefab of the persistent objects. Now, what I want to do is not actually have this persistent object in the scene, but have it spawned in by a class. And I'm going to call that class the persistent object spawner. So I'm going to create a new class over in Visual Studio. I'm going to have it under core, Visual Studio Code rather. I'm going to create a new class called persistent object spawner.cs. And I am going to create the mono behavior, and I'm going to namespace it to core, RPG core. And what I'm going to do with this spawner, while we've got it created, let's just go ahead and I'm going to go into the core prefab, because we want this spawner in every scene. We want whichever scene we start in, we want the persistent objects to get spawned. So I'm going to add this core persistent object spawner onto the core prefab, the root of that. It doesn't really matter where it goes. And then what I'm going to want is a reference to the serialize field, a game object, because basically I want a prefab here, and I want to know what is the persistent object prefab. So that's what I'm going to call this object here. And then we can implement an awake method, and what we want to do is basically instantiate the persistent object prefab. But how do we know if this is the first scene? How do we know we haven't already created this persistent object prefab, and as the name suggests, it has persisted from the previous scene? Well, the way I'm going to do this is with a static variable. It's going to be a bool has spawned. So if you've never come across a static variable before, here's a quick description. A normal variable usually lives and dies with the class. So in the case of our spawner, between scenes, you would lose the state of the Boolean, whether it has spawned or not. With a static variable, however, it lives and dies with the application rather than with the instance of the class, which means that once we have set this Boolean in one instance of the class, in a future scene where we've got a new instance of the persistent object spawner, that is going to remember the value that it was set before. Now, generally, this is a bad idea because it's a global variable, but in this case, we've got very few options with the way Unity is structured. And we're going to default it to false. So by default, we haven't spawned. So in awake, I'm going to say if has spawned, then we're just going to return and not do anything. And otherwise, we are going to set has spawned true, and we're going to call the spawn persistent objects function, which I'm going to create now, so control dot to generate that. And that should basically do the trick. So what we're going to do here is create that prefab and set it to don't destroy on load. If you like, you can take that as a little mini challenge for you. Okay, so what we're going to get back once we instantiate is a game object, and I'm going to call this the persistent object, like so. And we're going to instantiate the prefab, which is the persistent object prefab, which we've got in our serialized field here, like so. And then what? So once we've got that instantiated, we want to make sure that it won't be destroyed on load so that it hangs around. Simple as that. So let's see whether this has worked. Our core now has this persistent object spawner. It's asking for a prefab. Let's drop in the prefab that we created over in game core, which is our persistent objects. And that basically has all the objects we want to hang around. So if I go ahead and hit play, let's see if it's doing what we'd expect. We've got this don't destroy on load part of the scene, which is a persistent object clone, and it has got the fader under it. So if I go through the portal, notice it doesn't spawn another fader. We don't get any more fading, but we've still got the fader from the previous scene hanging around. So that's done the job, and we haven't had to use a single singleton. But the astute among you will have noticed that we did use a static. So it is sort of like a singleton, but not quite. And it's certainly not a way of getting access to the persistent objects. For that, we have to rely on things like find object and tags and all those other mechanisms that we know and love. So with all that done, we can now actually access the fader from our transition. And doing that, we can very easily just do it with a, let's see, the fader. I'm going to have a fader object to store here, and I'm just going to do a find object by type. And that's going to be of type fader, like so. And with this, we can now call all of its public methods, which are the fade out and the fade in. And in fact, I'm going to remove this coroutine now because we no longer need that. We were just using that for testing purposes to show you how you can call coroutines within coroutines, which you're going to use now in your challenge to fade between scenes. So you want to fade out completely before the scene load, then fade back in afterwards. And maybe you want to have a little wait while the screen is completely faded out to allow the camera to settle and for the player not to see any jiggling around of the camera or the player, which is a good idea. And make it all configurable so the designer can change the parameters of how long it is to fade out, fade in, and wait. Pause the video and have a go at this challenge. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully that wasn't too tricky. Let's give it a shot. So we've got this don't destroy on load. We're doing finding our fader. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and put some line breaks in here, and just before our yield return to load the scene asynchronously, I'm going to make sure that we are completely faded out, which basically means that we're going to do a yield return to make sure that a coroutine has finished. And we're going to call the fader.fadeOut coroutine with a time that I want to have configurable. So to make these times configurable, I'm going to add some serialized fields. So first serialized field is going to be float and the fade out time, and I'm going to default this to 2 seconds maybe. 2 seconds might be a bit long. We probably want to fade out quite quickly, like so. Then I'm going to copy and have a fade in time, and that can be a bit longer, and then we'll have a fade wait time, I'll call it, and that'll be like very small, 0.5 or something like that. So now we can use those variables in our fade out. We're going to have a fade out time as we fade out. And then once the scene comes back up, we are going to make sure we've done all of our setup. So we've got the other portal, updated our player. Then we are going to do our yield return. And I'm just going to do a wait for seconds. So that's going to be new, wait for seconds. And we're going to use the fade wait time there. And the idea there is that we've done all of our setup, we've moved the player, and then the waiting, we're just going to wait 5 seconds or 0.5 seconds for the camera to stabilize and things like that. And then once we've done that, we can start the process of yield return fader.fade in. And that's going to be the fade in time, like so. And then when that's finally finished, the job of this current portal is done, so we can go ahead and destroy it. And you can see how this is all happening asynchronously. We're not having to pause the whole game. We're just being able to say fade out over a series of frames, then load over a series of frames, update the player and wait for a series of frames, and then fade in over a series of frames. So this whole function can take many frames to run. That's the whole beauty of the coroutine. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. I'm going to go ahead and hit play and see if our character, so there's no fade happening right now. If I go through the portal, fades down, fades back up slowly in the new world. Now, this is all configurable. I felt that first fade was a little bit slow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the fader prefab and just change it for all the instances of the fader. Nope, sorry, I need to go to the portal prefab and change it for all the instances of the portal because we put our fade out times on the portal. So the fade out, I'm going to make 0.5 seconds, really quick. The fade in time, just 1 second long, and the wait time 0.5. Let's give that a shot. If I go and play, fades out pretty quickly so that my running animation doesn't look like it comes to an end. So it looks like he's just running on into the next level, and then the fade in looked pretty good. So to recap, what we've achieved in this lecture is the ability to call our fader in our transition period, and we've done that by allowing our fader to live between scenes and essentially be a singleton without using the singleton pattern by using this persistent object spawner instead. And hopefully you see how that's nice and neat. Our persistent object spawner is a small class, and the fader itself managed to say a small class too, and each is responsible for its own job. So that brings us to the end of this scene management section. I hope you agree that it's quite fun to be able to transition between scenes with this fading visualization and be able to go through multiple portals and appear at the other side of a level. And that gives you lots of levers to pull and position and put together many levels in quite a wide and large world. I really look forward to seeing what maps of worlds you come up with. Please go and share them over on the forum linked against this lecture.